So hi everyone, my name is Abby Currier and I'm the Community Engagement and Events Coordinator here at the History Center of Olmsted County. I'm so excited to see everyone on here tonight and I look forward to learning more this evening about the history of baseball. Here at the History Center of Olmsted County, we invite people to gather and explore and examine our past as we educate ourselves about the history of southeastern Minnesota and Olmsted County. We're so excited that you have decided to join us tonight as we take a look at one of these stories. Tonight, we're going to have a presentation from David Vaught on Abner Doubleday Revisited, Baseball in Rural America. After his presentation, we should have about 15 minutes for questions from the audience. During the presentation, feel free to put any questions you may have in the chat, and we'll try to answer as many of them as we can. Before we can get started, I do want to go over a couple of logistical things. For tonight, we are going to keep all of you muted so that we can listen to our speaker. Like I said, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat and we'll get to them as soon as we can. We may also put some links in there throughout the night, so make sure you keep an eye on it. Anything that we put into the chat, we'll be sure to send to you tomorrow, along with a quick survey about tonight's program. It takes less than 2 minutes to fill out, and we really appreciate your feedback. We also recommend watching this in presenter view, but if you want to see everyone participating Brady Bunch style, you can do that by clicking on the view button in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. If you're joining us from an iPad or a tablet, you may have to swipe across your screen a couple times to change the view. We're recording tonight's program, so please keep that in mind. We're so excited about tonight's talk and hope that you will continue to join us for some of our future events, where we will talk about everything from the history of acid rain, to Mayo Woods historic landscape, to the CCC in Minnesota, and everything in between. These talks are one of the many great benefits to having a membership to the History Center of Olmsted County. We certainly hope that you will continue to join us for these talks, and we also hope that you will consider getting a membership to experience even more benefits. Tonight, we are joined by David Vaught, who is a professor of history at Texas A&M University. He is the author of 4 books, The Farmer's Game, Baseball in Rural America, which was the winner of the 2014 Society for American Baseball Research SABR Baseball Research Award, Teaching the Big Class, Advice from a History Colleague, After the Gold Rush, Tarnished Dreams in the Sacramento Valley, and Cultivating California, Growers, Specialty Crops, and Labor, 1875 to 1920. Vaught's forthcoming book with Texas A&M University Press is entitled Spitter, Baseball's Notorious Gaylord Perry, and it's a biography of the notorious Hall of Fame pitcher that examines his rich and revealing life experience, from Perry's innovative ascent from rural poverty in eastern North Carolina to baseball stardom, to his subsequent descent to failure on the farm during the 1980s agricultural crisis. Vaught's research has been funded by 3 fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities. He is a past president of the Agricultural History Society, former head of department, university distinguished lecturer, and recipient of the Melbourne G. Glasscock Professorship in Undergraduate Teaching Excellence. That is quite a lot of accomplishments there, Professor. Are you ready?
I am.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much. I only wish I could be there with you. But instead, I invite you into an office of a working historian. So I'll get started. So few figures have ascended into American folklore with so little effort as Abner Doubleday. In 1905, baseball's promoters, led by sporting goods magnate Albert Spalding, convened a special commission to determine the game's origin. It had long been assumed that baseball had evolved from English stick and ball games, most notably rounders and cricket. But with big league baseball not yet a big-time commercial success, and at a time of rampant nationalist fervor and anti-British chauvinism, Spalding's commission much preferred a purely American origin and a heroic American inventor. So, acting with little pretense of objectivity, the commission placed ads in newspapers across the country asking old-timers to recall their earliest memories of the game. Based on the response of one individual, Denver resident Abner Graves, the commission decreed that in the spring of 1839, future Civil War general Abner Doubleday created baseball while fooling around with his schoolmates in a cow pasture in the village of Cooperstown, New York. Just like that, baseball acquired an official beginning, a distinctly rural American origin, and a romantic pastoral appeal. Over the decades, this has been reinforced by, among other things, the grand opening of the National Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown in 1939, celebrating the game's centennial, by more than a few Gary Cooper and Kevin Costner movies, and by the words of seemingly every baseball broadcaster on opening day, depicting in nostalgic bliss the green grass, blue sky, fresh air, and carefree atmosphere of the ballpark. All along, however, equally fervent but more empirically minded enthusiasts presented irrefutable evidence that baseball was neither born in America, let alone Cooperstown, nor a product of rural life. Its persistence among the general public notwithstanding, no serious student of the game has ever taken the Doubleday tale seriously. Nonetheless, the Doubleday myth has created a giant trap that often ensnares historians. Because they tend to be temporalists by nature, historians are powerfully drawn to the subject of beginnings. As such, they sometimes get stuck in what the great French historian Marc Bloch famously called the idol of origins, which is to say, the tendency to fixate on the origins or process of a process or phenomenon so much that the process or phenomenon itself, when it became most important, gets lost in the process. The idol of origins speaks directly to the phenomenon of baseball. In their zeal to debunk the myth of baseball's rural origins and to expose the propagandists who have long sought to give the sport a pastoral image, historians of the game have all but neglected the very real phenomenon of rural baseball itself. While the game as we now know it did develop most fully in New York City in the 1840s and 1850s, the corollary, indeed axiom, that baseball was a city game for city men for the rest of the century and beyond does not stand up to empirical scrutiny any more than the Doubleday myth itself. From the very beginning, whenever that was, rural people embrace the game every bit as much as city people, though not always for the same reasons. What better way then to begin this evening than by focusing directly on the game in Cooperstown and the surrounding countryside in the 1830s, with Abner Doubleday and Marc Bloch as my sources of inspiration, before proceeding on to two additional case studies: baseball in rural California in the 1880s and baseball in Southwest Minnesota in the 1950s. In rural communities like Cooperstown, baseball evolved and became popular long before it became a profession or a commercial enterprise. That very subject compelled F.H. Gutwitz, a farmer from nearby Steuben County, to write the editor of Harper's Weekly in 1859. A recent article had maintained that the new game of baseball was entertaining, but only for participants in a few great cities. "Sir," wrote Gutwitz, "you are mistaken. I can assure you that the game is a popular one in nearly all the villages and rural districts in Western New York, and has been for at least 20 years, i.e. since the 1830s. Goodfitz went on to explain that ball games were often linked to other social occasions, such as fairs, dancings, barn raisings, reunions, and thus were a significant focus of community social activity. Evidence from Cooperstown itself corroborates Goodfitz's observations and suggests, in addition, that early on, the common sort was much more likely to embrace the game than the gentile. Shortly after enacting an ordinance forbidding villagers to let their geese, swine, and cows run loose to forage in the streets for grass and rubbish, Cooperstown's Board of Trustees passed an anti-ball ordinance in June of 1816, the first documented mention of baseball in Cooperstown, that no person shall play at ball in 2nd or West Street in this village under a penalty of $1 for each and every offense. A rather ironic twist for the place known for the birthplace of baseball. Still, the ordinance strongly suggests that the presence in Cooperstown of some form of baseball for some period of time. And the ball games were apparently permissible at other locations, just not in the middle of town. Long before Cooperstown became associated with baseball, James Fenimore Cooper, the first great and popular novelist in the United States, had already put the village on the map with his famous series of Leatherstocking Tales. In one of his more obscure works, Home is Found, published in 1838, several references to ball playing can be found. Though fiction, much of the plot and content of the novel mirrors events in Cooper's own life, including an extended passage in which baseball, as played by a group of unruly rural residents, becomes a vehicle for the decline of order and decorum in Jacksonian America in general, and Cooperstown in particular. While Edward Effingham, Cooper's alter ego, and his family personify all the accomplishments, culture, and social refinement, ball-playing villagers and tenant farmers who are trespassing on the front lawn of the Effingham mansion symbolize the common sort's alarming lack of manners, refinement, and deference to genteel civility. Cooper did not have to explain the significance of baseball to his readers. He took for granted their familiarity with the game, but also their understanding of its cultural meaning. Local historians have documented that the ball game in Cooper's novel were played on the site immediately adjacent to where the Hall of Fame now stands. Not far away from that very spot, longtime residents of the village organized an old-timers game in 1877 with the express purpose of showing the members of the younger generation how to play the old-fashioned game of our boyhood 40 years earlier in the 1830s. The front page of the local newspaper reported the exciting play on the field, as well as participants' memory of ball playing in decades past. The popularity of reenacting baseball as played in earlier times continued through the end of the century and beyond, even to this day, which strongly suggests, along with the other evidence, that Goodfitz was not off base in his letter to Harper's Weekly. In the 1830s and the 1840s, rural residents of upstate New York notwithstanding an elite distaste for public ball playing, were playing the game and playing it with considerable enthusiasm. Now, in the interest of full disclosure, the game to which Goodfitz, Cooper, and the others referred was not baseball, not as we would recognize it, that is. It was a baseball-like game with many variations and many names, among them Old Cat, Barn Ball, Round Ball, and probably most often, Town Ball. In most versions, the infield was square, with no foul lines or fixed positions in the field. 8 to 15 men, and sometimes as many as 50, played on a side. The feeder was actually the least important player. His job was merely to toss the ball to the striker, who could actually demand where he wanted the ball and could wait as long as he wanted until he got his pitch. The ball could be hit in any direction, including directly behind the striker. A single out retired the side, and a runner was out if the ball was caught either on the fly or on one bounce, or if he was soaked or plunked, which is to say, hit with a thrown ball when running the bases. A fixed number of runs, usually 100, won the game. And again, the rules varied from region to region, even town to town. Baseball, the game as we know it, gradually replaced the chaos of town ball with a more ordered, rational approach by limiting play to 9 men on each side, imposing a diamond with foul lines extending outward and confining play within that area, fixing the length of a game at 9 innings, and replacing the 1-out rule with 3 outs to allow for more sustained play. Now, why the game changed in precisely this manner is one of those cultural phenomenon that is hard to explain. But it's not so difficult to tell when the new game took hold. As early as the 1830s, teams began to incorporate these rules little by little. And by the late 1850s, town ball's appeal was clearly on the wane. Keep in mind that certain other fundamental elements of the game, as we know it, would not fully be incorporated until the 1880s, including the distance between the pitcher's mound and home plate, the number of balls and strikes, the meaning of a foul ball, and even overhand pitching. One of the best sources of evidence that historians have to trace the game's progression, it turns out with considerable irony, are the 2 long letters that Abner Graves wrote to the Spalding Commission in 1905, depicting Abner Doubleday's invention of baseball, both of which are on file at the Baseball Hall of Fame Library. I explore Graves's reminiscences in great detail in my book, The Farmer's Game. But for the sake of time, let me just say here that much of what Graves wrote actually rings true. From his depiction of the diamond-shaped infield, to several of the rule changes in progress, to the name of the new game itself, to the street layout of Cooperstown and the names of the other boys, to where they actually played, and even, quite possible, to Doubleday's involvement. Though Spalding's commission chose 1839 as the year of the invention, Graves explicitly dated his remarks to the spring of the log cabin and hard cider campaign of General Harrison for president, which was in fact 1840. A simple check of West Point's personnel records reveals that Doubleday, a cadet at the time, was granted leave at precisely that time. He might very well have traveled to Cooperstown to visit his father and several cousins who actually lived in town or nearby. Indeed, it seems entirely within the realm of possibility that at some point in his travels, Doubleday might have acquired a knowledge of a new variety of ball called with increasing frequency baseball, and diagrammed the new game in the pasture that fateful day, just as Graves claimed to have witnessed it, with the young impressionable boy perceiving mistakenly, but understandably, that the West Point cadet he so very much admired had actually invented the game. Now, this sort of speculation is not my usual practice as a historian, but I make an exception to make a point. The significance of Graves's letters, and the entire Doubleday myth for that matter, has really nothing to do with the origins of baseball. That is a futile search for all the energy that has been devoted to it. As one historian has observed, to ascertain who invented baseball would be equivalent to trying to locate the discoverer of fire. Instead, the significance of Graves's letters lies in the fact that baseball, some version of it anyway, had already become rooted in the region's rural life by the time Abner Doubleday supposedly had invented it, a cultural phenomenon that has escaped the attention of baseball historians and rural historians alike. Okay. Still another sign of the vitality of the game of baseball early on was how well it migrated. We know this most assuredly with the Civil War. Thousands of soldiers of both armies encountered the game for the first time, took to its excitement, brought it home to their communities, and in the process, greatly enhanced the game's popularity. Less well known is the fact that the game traveled cross-country more than a decade before the Civil War. Tens of thousands of 49ers, among them Abner Graves, brought the game with them, played it on the Overland Trail, and introduced it to the gold fields and the rural regions of California. Over the next 3 decades, the game gradually gained a stronger foothold and then caught fire in the 1880s, when farmers spent a great deal of time playing, watching, and reading about it in their local newspapers. By 1885, rural California had become, as one put it, devoted to the game, as revealed with special clarity by the Davisville Olitas and the Dixon Etnas, 2 teams 10 miles apart in the Sacramento Valley. These farmers' newfound passion for the game coincided with a period of far-reaching social, economic, and generational change in rural California. Their fathers, most of them failed miners turned farmers, helped transform the Sacramento Valley into one of the most productive agricultural regions in the world. They began by supplying miners and residents of San Francisco with much of their grain and beef. As wheat production skyrocketed toward the end of the 1860s, they helped California earn its reputation as the granary of the world, as fully 3/4 of the state's annual crop, upwards of 41 million bushels, was shipped 14,000 nautical miles to hungry bread eaters in England. California farmers took great pride in the knowledge that their wheat moved in greater volume over greater distances than any product ever before in human history. Their chief motivator, however, was fear. At mid-century, most American farmers were market participants of various degrees of enthusiasm, but they also still strongly believed in the traditional values of rural life: hard work, mutuality, family, and religion. The gold rush did not turn farmers into capitalists, nor did it undermine their agrarian principles. While their basic values did not change, the pressure to live up to them, to succeed both economically and socially, increased enormously. Admitting failure a second time was simply not an option. Even with the ravages of flood and drought, monumental disputes over Mexican land titles, mass confusion over federal and state land policies, and the vagaries of local, national, and world markets that made farming in the Sacramento Valley in the latter half of the 19th century an immense challenge. In the late 1870s, the state's great bonanza wheat era began to wane as farmers in Europe, Asia, and Australia, many of them using techniques and machines imported from California, planted wheat of their own. Overproduction sent wheat prices plummeting. The next generation of California farmers, including those in Davisville and Dixon, then turned from wheat to fruit, in one of the most rapid and complete transformations ever witnessed in American agricultural history. This shift was fraught with conflict and anxiety from the beginning. Sons inherited their father's dreams of striking it rich and pursued them with equal passion. They too would spend their lives struggling to resolve the great paradox of agriculture in the modern economic world. Farmers' very identity, their inner drive to produce, invariably gluts the market, brings low prices, and spreads misery and frustration. This was the context in which baseball's popularity soared to unprecedented heights. Anxious to be distracted from their arduous daily routines and the uncertainties of the time, young adult Davisville and Dixon farmers found baseball to be the perfect antidote. They might have pursued horse racing, which had been the most popular spectator sport in the Sacramento Valley. The two sports had much in common. The racetrack helped develop rural people's fascination with swift motion and sudden action, which the ball field, located in the middle of the track in both towns, cultivated to the utmost. But baseball's new rules, adopted by both teams early in the decade, imposed a more precise, detailed order on its participants than did horse racing. On defense, players trotted out together to the same positions every inning and tried to hone their best to hone their individual skills for the good of the team. And on offense, they tried to hit the ball within the foul lines and away from the fielders, run the bases without being tagged out, and parlay their individual efforts into runs, the game's most meaningful measure of achievement. They performed these actions automatically, without pause for concern, because the game itself dictated it. For young men mystified by the operations of the grain market and wary of the future, but like their fathers, were unable even to admit the possibility of failure. Baseball offered excitement, stability, diversion, mutuality, and gratification, all in powerful, albeit short-term, doses. Other factors also contributed to the epidemic of baseball, as one farmer put it, that hit the region in the 1880s. Farmers often did not want play to interrupt work. During the harvest of 1885, for example, an enraged father, shotgun in hand, stormed the Davisville diamond in the fourth inning and marched his adult son back to the farm. Players also spoke of the game's manly qualities, its aggressive, competitive aspects, as did so many young Americans of this generation. Baseball also helped tame two interrelated ethno-cultural conflicts in the two towns. Since the early 1870s, a disgruntled minority, led by the leaders of the Davisville Presbyterian Church, had decried the region's lack of respect for the Sabbath and for temperance. At first, baseball on Sundays served only to fuel the fire. But gradually, even the most militant reformers accepted and even welcomed the idea. Some of the more thoughtful among the temperance advocates, said one farmer, prefer to have the crowds at the ball game rather than the alehouse. By the 1880s, the saloon keepers were the ones grumbling about the game's popularity. The epidemic of baseball spread across racial lines as well, in one particularly illuminating instance. Two of the best players on the Dixon Etnas, brothers Jose and Ezidro Pena, had roots in the area much deeper than any of their teammates. Their grandfather, Juan Felipe Pena, migrated to California a decade before the gold rush and had owned Rancho Los Putos, one of 3 Mexican land grants in the area. The overwhelmingly Anglo community of Dixon treated Jose and Ezidro as social outcasts as they grew up. That is, until both brothers demonstrated that they could hit. The Pena boys became fixtures in the Etna's lineup. Jose at second base and Ezidro in center field, and led the team to numerous victories. Though Ezidro died in a farm accident in 1894, Jose took advantage of his prowess on the ball field to become a successful cattleman. Descendants of the Pena family still reside in the area today. Not because of baseball, of course, not entirely so, but the game did help them carve out a place in the community. Perhaps the strongest symptom of this baseball epidemic was the widespread gambling that permeated these two towns. This was not a new phenomenon. Farmers, by the very nature of their enterprise, were gamblers. Every year, they rolled the dice on the weather, the yield of their crop, and just when to sell it to get the best price. They also bet on billiards, dice games, pitching horseshoes, pigeon shooting, the outcome of elections, whether or not someone would survive an illness, on just about anything. And gambling was the mother's milk of horse racing. So smitten was one local farmer that he borrowed $100 to make a bet and then refused to pay it back when his horse lost the race. When his lender took him to court, the bettor insisted that anyone with any sense of honor would have given him another chance to pick a winner. And the jury of his peers agreed with him. Gambling deepened almost everyone's fascination with baseball as well. The modern game, with its ordered, rational rules, provided not only an antidote to the uncertainties of modern life, but an opportunity to bet on the uncertainties of modern life. Wagers could be placed on the final score, but also on whether or not the next batter would get a hit, the next pitch would be a strike, or the next fly ball would be caught, prompting bettors on one occasion to fire their guns in the air to disconcert the fielders. And the players themselves were not averse to playing for substantial winner-take-all purses, paying ringers from nearby towns to beef up their lineups, or taking bribes to throw games. Gambling was as much a part of baseball as hitting and pitching, and it was every bit as epidemic in the Sacramento Valley. The measure of success was plain in baseball, and in the end, that, as much as any one factor, attracted farmers to the game. More so than the various tavern sports or even horse racing, baseball tantalized them with the illusion that they could reverse their fortunes by simply courting Lady Luck, or, when teams tried to fix games, by manipulating her. There was something inherently liberating about this notion. Win or lose, the outcome of the game, not to mention the games within the game, was clearly defined, in sharp contrast to the difference between success and failure on their farms. Baseball and gambling had a cultural meaning to players and fans beyond the chance to make money. It allowed them to entertain the same impulse that had failed them during the gold rush, the gamble of the century. The excitement that baseball generated in these two towns was by no means unusual. From the 1880s through the 1950s, the small town team became an institution in rural America, every bit as much as the Little Red Schoolhouse and the old-fashioned 4th of July celebration. Diamonds dotted the countryside right alongside grain elevators, water towers, courthouse squares, and churches. The psychologist Hugo Munstenberg, trying to explain the magnitude of the game's popularity in small-town America to his German readers in 1914, estimated that on any given Sunday afternoon in the summer, baseball matches are played in more than 30,000 places. Munstenberg well understood that every small town in rural America that considered itself, in his words, a progressive modern place, had its own baseball team. Now, we do not normally think of small rural towns as progressive modern places. After all, the great paradox of supply and demand in agriculture became even more pronounced in the 20th century. Despite unimaginable gains in production, spurred by machines, chemicals, and improved plant and animal breeds, the 20th century was not kind to farmers. One crisis followed another. Economic crises, particularly in the 1920s, 30s, 50s, and 80s, and resulting demographic crises. In 1900, almost 50% of the labor force in the United States still earned a living from the soil. That proportion shrank in each succeeding census, until now less than 2% of the labor force is engaged in agriculture. Even in the 1920s and 1950s, decades normally associated with prosperity, good times on the farm were few and far between. The result was an exodus from the countryside that made rural to urban migrations in the 19th century pale in comparison. How then to explain this fundamental restructuring of American agriculture juxtaposed against this progressive image of rural life? Literature does not provide much help. Two reoccurring themes have prevailed: doom and gloom, as in the works of Hamlin Garland, Sinclair Lewis, and Jane Smiley, and the deep nostalgia conveyed by novelists from Laura Ingalls Wilder to Garrison Keillor. History is locked into a similar dichotomy, from Richard Hofstadter's culturally deprived and socially regressive farmers to Wendell Berry's glorification of them as the epitome of American individualism, independence, and democracy. Either way, farmers come across as traditionalists, backward-looking, predictable, with little or no agency or initiative. Perhaps novelists and historians have looked in the wrong places. For farmers and residents of small towns, even in this prolonged period of decline, the ball field functioned as a progressive modern place. At first glance, Milroy, Minnesota looks to be right out of a Sinclair Lewis novel. So small, so isolated, and so dominated by endless fields of corn and oats that it gives new meaning to the phrase middle of nowhere. Like many Midwestern towns, Milroy was born in 1902 on a drafting board of a railroad company, put on a fixed grid of 5 blocks by 5 blocks, and then left to compete for settlers and profits with other farming towns in southwest Minnesota, some 150 miles from Minneapolis, St. Paul. At seemingly every turn, Milroy lost. It lost to Marshall, 15 miles to the northwest, in the race to become the region's economic center. Redwood Falls, 30 miles to the east, beat out Milroy for the county seat. And to add insult to injury, Laura Ingalls Wilder chose nearby Walnut Grove, not Milroy, as the setting for Little House on the Prairie. Milroy's population has never surpassed 300. Its main street has never been more than 2 blocks long. And to this day, the 5 by 5 grid has neither expanded nor filled in completely. Yet, from the very outset, baseball was all the rage in Milroy. Its teams were good in the first decade of settlement, even better in the 1920s, and phenomenal in the late 1940s, when they competed several times in the annual Minnesota State Amateur Tournament. And then, in 1954, the Milroy Yankees achieved the unthinkable. They went 33-3 in Redwood League play to advance to the tournament, then won the 4-game single elimination Class B, small town, state championship. And then before a crowd of 4,000 in St. Cloud, they scored 3 runs in the 7th inning to come from behind to beat Class A state champion Benson 4-3 to win the state title outright, which no Class B team had ever done before. The winning run scored on a suicide squeeze play, no less. Class A teams came from much larger towns, often 6,000 to 8,000 people, and were allowed to pay salaries to 2 players. In all, more than 700 teams in the 2 divisions competed in Minnesota amateur baseball in 1954, with only 1 left standing, tiny little Milroy. When the champs returned home, their families and neighbors appropriately jammed the parlor of St. Michael's Church for a community banquet, appropriately because baseball had long been a family and community affair in Milroy. Most of the players were 2nd or 3rd generation residents. And the Dolan family, with 4 players on the starting team, went back 4 generations to the area's first homesteaders. Like most rural activities, baseball required considerable cooperation. Most of the players were farmers who worked long and hard, 6 days a week, all summer, and the farm had to come first. Louis Dolan would have missed the first 2 games of the 1954 tournament had 25 neighbors not dropped everything to help him finish his oat harvest. Nor did baseball on Sundays preempt church. Players attended their house of worship, Catholic, Lutheran, Methodist, or Presbyterian, in the morning, with ministers often speeding up their sermons to finish in time for the first pitch, or even excusing players midway through for road games. For decades, Milroy teams, heavy in German, Norwegian, and Irish players, reflecting the population of Southwest Minnesota, crossed ethnic and religious boundaries for players who could pitch, catch, and hit the long ball. Baseball, church, and farming, that's what we were, recalled Rich Kramer, the team's best hitter, summarizing the importance of custom and heritage in shaping players' lives. There was also a strong defensive strain in Milroy's passion for baseball that was rooted in the region's fierce economic rivalries. From the days the towns were born, they competed. The number of possible settlers to attract was fixed by the size of farms and amount of surrounding farmland. The result was that one town's gain often constituted another town's loss. The steady decline of a region blessed with fertile soil, abundant water, and hardworking citizens made for all the more contentious relations between towns. These underlying rivalries and winner-take-all mentalities played out in Sunday games. Crowds could be enormous, and competition for bragging rights heated. Milroy, for example, beat arch-rival Wanda in a league playoff game in 1948 before 2,300 fans, an attendance that was 5 times the combined population of the 2 towns. The chatter from the dugouts could be unmerciful. You wouldn't hear humbada, or let's go boys, but more likely, stick it in his ear, or who was that I saw with your wife last night? Play on the field was rough, and brawls were not uncommon, especially when Marshall came to town. Milroy bent its greatest energies to beat Marshall, which had outdone its rival economically, but not on the diamond. When asked what they most enjoyed about playing baseball for Milroy, the players invariably responded, beating Marshall. Marshall has tradition, one added. Milroy has tradition, one added. Marshall don't. Baseball did provide Milroy tradition, along with a powerful community identity. But it also revealed the innovative and indeed progressive aspects of farmers' ideas and actions. Under the leadership of player-manager Bob Zwatch, the team did everything it could to win, including watering down the baselines to slow down fast teams, freezing balls to take the bounce out of them, and riveting bottle caps to pitchers' belts so they could scuff balls to embellish their sliders. Zwatch built the team with cunning and persistence. His greatest coup was recruiting a farm boy, Reed Loveness, who returned home to Cottonwood in 1952 after pitching 3 years in the minors in the Pittsburgh Pirates organization. Just how nearby became an issue of much controversy. Class B teams were not allowed to sign players who lived more than 15 miles away. Cottonwood was a good 20-mile drive, but Zwatch determined with a map and a compass that it was exactly 15 miles as the crow flies between the outer edge of Milroy and the outer edge of Loveness's farm. The lanky right-hander accepted Zwatch's offer because while making $250 a month in pro ball, he raked in as much as $600 a month playing for Milroy. Not from salary, because that was against the rules, but from shares of the team's income left over at the end of the season after all expenses were paid, as Zwatch later explained it. At the banquet in St. Michael's Church, the team agreed to pay Loveness all the shares. He had, after all, struck out 20 batters in the championship game. The team had that kind of money because the players were such good fundraisers and because the fans were such good donators. Supporting the local ball club required more than gate receipts provided. Teams not only paid big bucks for stars like Loveness, they also had to buy uniforms and equipment, maintain the field, pay the umpires, and transport themselves to away games. This was a private effort, except for the special license that the team obtained from the village council to sell beer on Sundays, which itself was a lucrative fundraising activity. With pride overflowing after the championship season, the community decided to build a new state-of-the-art ball field for their beloved Yankees. 75 families pledged $10 to $100, enough to purchase the land, 5.5 acres. And then dozens of volunteers working in the evenings after farming all day, built the grandstand, leveled the infield, laid the outfield turf, and enclosed the field with a wooden fence, all in time for the 1955 season to begin. With expectations from the community now higher than ever, the pressure to win mounted, especially after the Minnesota Amateur Baseball Association, filled with suspicion about the Loveness deal and the Yankees' success, forced small Milroy into the ranks of Class A. The Yankees proved powerful at that level as well, beating Marshall twice and coming within a single pitch with 2 outs in the 9th inning of entering the state semifinals. Loveness, already with 18 strikeouts, threw a 2-2 fastball right down the middle, but the umpire missed the call, later apologizing with tears in his eyes. And sure enough, the next pitch was hit for a 3-run homer to win the game. Though the players and the fans could not have known it at the time, that frustrating finish foretold the end of the glory days of Milroy baseball. even as the national economy was enjoying one of its greatest periods of growth, small rural towns like Milroy trudged through a long period of stagnation. The rural economy had been in decline since the 1920s, with the brief post-World War II boom proving to be just a blip in the downward curve. In 1955, we can see in retrospect, the town faced a future that offered little hope and considerable despair. As young people increasingly migrated to Mankato, St. Cloud, or the Twin Cities to find jobs, and as the population that stayed put became increasingly older and poorer, local baseball declined in participation and popularity, a trend that television and the arrival of the Minnesota Twins in 1961 accentuated all the more. But if we allow hindsight to shape our understanding of the past, we will miss the significance of baseball. For decades, Milroy farmers expressed themselves on the baseball diamond, not with a sense of fatalism, but with passion, ingenuity, and a burning desire to beat their rivals one way or another. Farmers, these case studies suggest, responded culturally to the challenges of modernity, not just economically or politically, as has been more thoroughly documented. When they played baseball or rooted for their home favorite team, they displayed some of the central elements of rural culture: competitiveness, materialism, and individualism, as well as hard work, cooperation, and mutuality. Baseball offered not only an outlet for the tensions of rural life, but a means of translating a core set of values into action. Each game was a great social drama, full of excitement, suspense, and opportunity, but void of paradox. Players and spectators could express themselves freely, take risks, even poorly calculated ones, with little regard to the long-term consequences. Their very identity, that inner drive to produce, found expression and gratification on the ball field, rather than the misery and frustration they often experienced on their farms. There was nothing magical about the game. Baseball came along at the right time to satisfy farmers' insatiable appetite for achievement in a world of change and chance. Baseball may have been a source of rural nostalgia for city people, but it was the sport of choice for farmers and a powerful cultural agent. That, my friends, is the true legacy of Abner Doubleday. Thank you.
Thank you. That was so good. I don't think I'd mentioned it before, but we actually have a vintage baseball team that plays at the History Center during the summer season.
I think you did mention that.
You did? Okay. So if anyone on the call has any questions, feel free, like I said, to put them in the chat, or if you want to unmute yourselves, we can do that as well. It's a fairly small group here. And then our first questions come in. So could the new / modern rules that you were talking about at the beginning of your presentation have been developed at West Point? The Army is known for their rules and order. Is that a possibility?
I don't want to get into where they develop so much. I think it's quite possible that a place like West Point, baseball became popular, although I don't really have any evidence of that. There is quite a bit of evidence that the new rules of baseball became most popular really in New York City in the 1840s and 1850s, but they spread out. Again, baseball migrates very, very, very easily, and they spread out and clearly spread as far as central New York.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you came to this topic, like what drew you to learning about the origins of baseball?
Boy, that's kind of tough.
Sorry.
No, it's all right. Because actually, if you ask any historian what led you to your topic, it sounds like such a simple question, but often there's sort of myriad of things that lead you to it. So first of all, by trade and by training, I'm a American agricultural / rural historian. That is, I study farmers. I study how farmers saw their world, farmers' worldview, their culture, that sort of thing. And I did so in my first two books in California, farmers in California in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So when I finished those books, my editor, gosh, I remember this distinctly now. My editor asked me, well, what are you going to do next? And what would you do if you had absolutely no restrictions whatsoever preventing you from doing it? Well, my other great passion in life, besides history, was baseball from my earliest memories. Been lifetime San Francisco Giants fan. And I just remember sort of blurting out to him that I'd like to combine those two passions, in part because while I was doing research for the California books in this one town of Dixon that I spoke about, the newspaper, which I went through, for decades, in the 1880s, the newspaper, which is sort of typical 4-page weekly rural newspaper, had a column that was written by the same person for 10 or 15 years, which he just listed items for the previous week. Sometimes there were gossip items, informational items. And during the summer, one of his paragraphs was almost always on the game that week between Davisville and Dixon. I didn't really think much of it at the time, but I remembered. I remembered that and went back and photocopied all of those 10 moments over 10 years, and that became the basis of the first baseball article that was on these California two towns. And it just sort of grew from that decided I think I really had something here. And then it took me to all kinds of different places across the country and all kinds of different time periods from the early 19th century really to the present. Even there's a chapter on vintage baseball at the very end. Just a long answer, but you asked for it.
I know what I'm getting into when I ask those open questions. So in small rural communities with a team, who is responsible for recruiting players, organizing the team, ordering equipment, all that kind of stuff, maintaining the field? Would they have like a team manager, or was that just something one of the players would pick up?
I mean, in the Milroy team, it's the manager. The manager did everything, not just managing the game on the field, but all the various organization and fundraising activities. And this guy Bob Swatch, he was a real character, and people responded to him.
Okay. And then when you were talking about the teams in California, you mentioned this connection with gambling.
Oh yeah.
Were there any towns or groups that tried to ban baseball because of that connection?
There's more effort to ban it because of the drinking. But again, just, I mean, I'm basing this really on one quotation, but gradually the temperance people thought it was better to have the drinking confined on a Sunday afternoon on the ball field than spread out amongst the various saloons around the area. So there was some effort, but gambling was just so pervasive that nothing was going to stop it. Nothing was going to stop it anyway.
I have a question.
Sure.
David, can you hear me?
I can just speak a little, let's speak louder.
Just let me plug in here. I apologize,
I can't hear.
I've talked some about this, but I'm wondering about if you know much about the development of gloves and bats and the makeup of the baseball and other equipment, you know, like when were gloves first used and what the first baseballs look like?
So in town ball, which I tried to describe very briefly, the ball was not anywhere near as hard as the current baseball was. I mean, that's in fact because one of the ways you could get runners out was to actually throw the ball at them. I mean, you folks who play vintage baseball, I presume that you follow those rules where you actually can get a runner out by throwing the ball and hitting him with it. So the ball was almost kind of squishy. And then there's no sort of linear development as to how rules and equipment changed over quite a long period from the 1830s to the 1850s. It was much more of the world was much more of a local world in those times, so that things changed differently over time in different regions and in different areas. It's really by the mid 1880s that if we were there, we would actually recognize the game almost in every way. I mean, gloves, you talked about the gloves weren't anywhere near as large or as padded, but we would recognize the game. We wouldn't have recognized the game so much in 1830, except that you vintage ball players have now resurrected it enough so that it's become popular in itself.
Sorry, my Wi-Fi keeps cutting in and out, so I think if I keep my camera off, I might have better luck in staying in the meeting. So have you actually gone out and visited all of these different fields that you talk about in your book? Like, have you been to Milroy and?
Oh yes, I did research for the Milroy portion of the book in Marshall at the Southwest State University there. They have a history center there that had a nice little archive that even had some old recordings made or interviews with these players. And the folks there who were just very, very kind to me drove me all around the area. Most of the field at Milroy that they made in 1955 still there and just dominates the town. I mean, I have a sort of aerial view, a photograph of it. That, I mean, the field dominates the town. It's just really quite remarkable. So I had
So,
a blast doing. I had just had, it's always good to be able to visit places that you're writing about.
yeah, absolutely. Don, did you have a question?
No, I asked mine. Thank you.
Oh, okay. So were early players allowed to bet on their own games or gamble within the game itself?
That's a good question. I don't have any evidence of that. And I would doubt it's, well, I don't have any evidence, so I wouldn't speculate it on one way or the other.
One of the things I'm wondering, you talked about how the very early versions of the game we wouldn't really recognize and could change based on region. Were you able to find any evidence of like two teams coming together thinking that they were each playing a different version of the game?
No, I mean, I think the rules were generally shared within a region. And really with the earlier game, the most often called town ball, the rules were not so important as they are with the more modern game. The idea was to simply sort of, it's really not unlike the idea that vintage ball players have today, that the idea is really more to go out and play and enjoy yourself on a Sunday afternoon than it is to compete until the last person drops kind of mentality. It's really sort of a almost pre-industrial mentality.
Did you ever find any evidence of like co-ed teams or female teams?
Certainly the short answer to that is no. But certainly co-ed women, both in the California example and the Minnesota example, were avid fans.
What was one of the most surprising things you learned doing your research, either for this book or for your upcoming book?
Well, it was just the whole concept of rural baseball was surprising to me. I mean, I wrote 2 books on California agriculture, books that examine farmers in their social and cultural contexts, and had absolutely nothing in them about baseball, even though I had found this marvelous column in the newspaper. At the time, I just sort of dismissed it as not particularly important. I obviously went back later. It just the whole concept of it. Part of that is because we even historians, to a large extent, associate baseball with professional baseball and commercial baseball, which of course is a city game. But the popularity of baseball spread well beyond the professional game, and it did from the very beginning and still does to this day. It's one of the reasons that baseball is popular, because basically anybody can play it and sort of imagine themselves out there in the major leagues.
Were there any players that saw this rural baseball as like a stepping stone to try and get into one of those more professional leagues?
Oh yes. Now you're talking about my new book. So the new book is a biography of Gaylord Perry, who you baseball fans will, and particularly of a certain age, baby boomers, will very much remember, because he threw for almost his entire career through an illegal pitch, the spitter. But Perry grew up, and this is what made him interesting to me. He grew up in the tobacco belt of Eastern North Carolina, the son of a sharecropper family, very poor. And tobacco, when he was young in the 1940s and 50s, the cultivation of tobacco was pre-modern. I mean, no machines. I mean, it was cultivated no differently than it was cultivated at the end of the Civil War. So he grew up in that environment. Also, the racial developments in the South. He grew up in that environment. And so the book is about how he takes that coming of age in the 1940s and 50s in Eastern North Carolina, how he takes that into his career in professional baseball.
And we had another question. When does baseball become the official name?
Now that's one of these things that there are baseball historians, mostly non-academics, who scour newspapers, anything they can get their hands on, to try and beat themselves to when was the earliest mention of the word baseball, or as it was at first, it was two words, baseball. And boy, I'd have to look it up, but I think now have found that word traces back to the late 18th century. But its popularity, the popularity of the term in America doesn't really catch on until 1840s and especially 1850s.
All right. Does anyone have any other questions? If not, we're going to start to wrap up. So thank you so much to our audience tonight for asking so many great questions, and to our presenter for sharing his time and expertise with us. We hope that you enjoyed tonight's program and that you continue to join us in the future as we discuss everything from acid rain to Mayowood and so much more. Check out our website, olmstedhistory.com, to keep up to date on all of our events and programs. And if you enjoyed tonight's program, consider making a donation to help us continue to offer this and other great programs, or consider becoming a member. The History Center of Olmsted County membership offers a wide variety of benefits, including access to free and reduced cost events like this. Thank you so much to everyone who joined us tonight, and we hope to see you in the future. Good night.
Thank you.